Thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure for us to welcome you. The idea of this webinar is really to talk and present a bit the ideas behind PBRNs, because we thought it was a good opportunity to share experiences of what different researchers had setting them up, also running research, doing them, and all these advantages. Amy has already done a few presentations on that theme, and we're really happy to have her with us. Especially that she got up probably at 4:30 this morning in Australia to be there. And Amy has been setting up a few PBRNs in complementary care, both in Australia and New Zealand, which have had some success in bringing not only data for single studies, but also putting up communities that are able to share and run future research. And Jerry, which has worked recently on setting up PBRNs in the UK, also has gained a lot of experience in knowing the to-dos and not to-dos. So the idea of this these workshops is really to share with you global visions, and we'll have your Q&A session at the end so that we can also share problems and visions. We've set up the workshops in 3 different steps. So the first presentation is more to everyone. There can be practitioners who are interested in joining in and contributing to research. There might be also stakeholders and also researchers that are interested. The second one is more, what do we have to think of when we set up a webinar? So this one will take place in September. And the workshop 3 was more face-to-face, so we can all be together and really work on probably project-led PBRNs. And that one will take place at London. And we set it on the 9th of October because that's the day before the GOSC 30th year Congress. I think it's 30 years, isn't it? Or more.
It is. It's not the GOSC Congress, but the idea is that it's the 30th year of regulation of osteopathy in the UK. And it's the conference organized by the Institute of Osteopathy, the UCO, University College of Osteopathy, and CORE, and the OIA and EFFO / Osteopathy Europe are also taking part to that Congress.
So this will be probably a Congress where there's many also innovative views of what's happening in research and so on. And we thought it was a good occasion to be there because also of everything that's taking place. I think the IO has set up a webpage. We can already send in proposals for workshop on their Congress. So it might be an opportunity for people who want to attend both. We've put a restriction on the workshop number 3. The idea is that when we set up a PBRN, it has to be sustainable. So we thought it was better that it wasn't people-led, but more institution-supported. So one of the conditions is that people have an institution that supports the idea of setting up a PBRN, and so that PBRN can be linked to that institution. So that's for workshop 3. You're of course free to join in any of the workshops, 1 and 2. There's the videos that'll be there. You can go back to them and watch them whenever you want. So again, I'm really happy to welcome Dr. Amy Steele and Dr. Jerry Draper-Rody for this presentation. And the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and be able to share what I can about my experiences setting up and running PBRNs. This particular session, we're spending a little bit more time exploring the how and what value it has, as Paul said. So to start with, I'm going to do a bit of cover a bit of background, kind of conceptual, highlight some somewhat competing paradigms that are in place in health research at the moment, exploring how they can be employed by researchers and clinicians to ensure that the sort of research that's being produced for osteopathy is relevant for the real world, and then we'll kind of link in with how the PBRNs can really help us to achieve that. So just to start with, the few things that I'm really focusing in on at the moment around the modern health research and practice landscape is those concepts of evidence-based medicine, person-centered care, and real-world evidence. And those 3 concepts have been almost developing somewhat in parallel and not highly in connection with one another over the last few years. And so, we'll just sort of touch in a little bit on all 3 of those. Of course, evidence-based medicine is the most dominant. Most of us, will be familiar with the principles of EBM, so I'm not going to go over them again, but just want to focus on some important that will inform what we're talking about today. So firstly, EBM grew out of the medical research community and was developed with the aim of improving the quality of healthcare by basing clinical decisions on evidence produced by clinical research rather than the authority of expert clinicians. And while this is a noble and worthy aim, really to achieve this, the proponents of EBM needed to prioritise certain designs, namely RCTs or meta-analyses of RCTs, to inform clinical decision-making. However, since EBM was first documented in the 90s, clinicians from a wide range of health professions, particularly those who are in primary care, out in community, really questioned the ability of those types of designs to complex interventions. They queried whether it was relevant to have such a strong focus on RCT evidence at the expense of clinical expertise and patient preferences. So as a result, there was a modifying statement that came out that really amplified or acknowledged that those aspects are really important in applying clinical evidence. And at the same time, areas of integrative medicine or complementary medicine were definitely among those who really questioned whether or not RCTs were applicable to investigate the effectiveness or efficacy of their treatments and practices. Now, concurrent to this, evidence-based medicine began to be wielded as a weapon against what was then termed alternative medicine. And this is a quote from the Lancet. At the time, they did a special issue on CAM saying there is no alternative medicine. There is only scientifically proven evidence-based medicine supported by solid data or unproven medicine for which scientific evidence is lacking. Of course, the underlying premise of this quote is that clinicians in conventional medicine follow the evidence closely and will adopt and apply any treatment safe and effective, which really is not necessarily played out in a lot of the work that's been done since then, where even within their own remit of what they consider to be practices, the uptake of new evidence is actually quite slow in a lot of these professions. And so it doesn't actually play out to be in reality. Not to say that they don't accept new evidence, but there's the assumption that just as soon as it's proven, they'll start doing it, and there's no personal bias or anything in play is I think, flawed. So despite the modifications from the Oxford group, who were responsible for first describing EBM, the realities of EBM still saw research and clinical practice occurring in isolation, particularly because the RCT design focused on efficacy of treatments. And to do that, they had to exclude the potential confounders, which meant clinical, mechanistic, observational, was undertaken by researchers in controlled settings. The domains of clinician expertise and patient preferences were being applied within the clinical encounter after the research was conducted. And through the clinical encounter, the clinician was left to tease out the relevance of the RCT, figure out how best to move forward with the patient's preferences and values in mind. And then whatever decision was that arose from the clinical encounter, the patient still needed to adhere to the recommendation or prescription constraints and realities of their life. Even within a profession such as osteopathy, whereas a lot of the treatment in the room, there's still a lot of practices and recommendations that are still recommended and prescribed to the patient to adhere to outside of the room. So those issues still apply. And this kind of siloing of the elements of evidence-based medicine has proved in many ways to limit the ability of traditional RCTs to answer questions about real-world problems involving real people within real-world settings, and therefore to make a real-world difference. So moving beyond there's the almost dual paradigms of person-centered care, which is really that specific idea of really treating the person, and evidence-based medicine. The thread that links them is the growing need and expectation that the evidence of evidence-based medicine means something to the patient and the clinician in the real world, and that the knowledge needed to meet this need is much more diverse than RCTs and meta-analyses. This is a really great flow chart. This is actually from 1990, this article, and I've really not seen anyone capturing it quite so well. It's a list of knowledge requirements which are suggested to speak to the needs of policymakers and practitioners, two of the groups of primary knowledge users. These sort of knowledge types offer us a great framework for reflecting what we really need for osteopathy research to make sure the research is truly relevant to the people we want it to be available to. You know, looking at knowing about problems, you know, that just actually undertaking research that helps to figure out what we need to know. What are the gaps, and what are going to help serve and clinicians best for us to explore. And then, of course, there's the mechanistic research existing, you know, about how do we actually treat or address these problems if we've identified there's a gap in care, or that we want to get more evidence around knowing what it is that actually works, but also the knowing how things work, and just keeping in mind that the mechanistic of the know-how, yeah, we need to take into account some of those principle-based things as well. Some of the principles, you know, a component to how osteopaths go about approaching care, and those things need to be considered as well. And then we also have the knowledge that, you know, of what defines our stakeholders, who are osteopathy stakeholders, and lastly, knowledge about why osteopathy, what's its importance, its implications, and its values, and how that links to its wider acceptability. All of these types of knowledge are important. And it's also worth realizing that RCTs only actually answer this very first question in this flow diagram around efficacy. RCTs, you can do a comparative effectiveness RCT to demonstrate effectiveness, and then there's cost effectiveness. But even if you get to that cost effectiveness level, you still have to show that it's able to be delivered as a service. In delivering it as a service, people aren't going to miss out on other worthwhile services. And in order to get support from the government or from other health service funders, these last two elements, demonstrating service availability and service distribution, is essential. You can be as cost effective as you like, but if you're only delivering it in one region as a service, then you're not going to get support for wider support across the population or across the funding bodies. So this diversity of knowledge is actually really critical to undertaking good progress in osteopathy as a profession. So keeping that in mind, I mean, I know I've raised the criticisms regarding the EBM movement. The osteopathy research community isn't immune to the allure of producing research evidence that can be synthesized via meta-analysis, translated into clinical practice or policy briefs, and then, you know, watching the magic of them changing the face of policy and practice. After all, that's why most researchers get into the game, or, you know, overall, to help improve the health of the community through better healthcare, and of course clinicians as well. But research alone does not inform practice, as I said before. This is one of the issues that we have with conventional medicine. It's a process of knowledge translation is required to enable research findings to become meaningful to practitioners in their context. Even clinical practice change if they're not designed with the realities of the target clinician community in mind. And there's actually several reasons for that. Firstly, the burden of practice means there's a mismatch between demand and availability of resources, so time, money, staff. There might be a tension between professional ethics and bureaucracy. So simply telling a health professional to follow a protocol or guideline won't actually work if it conflicts with their own sense of professional ethics. Also important to consider how fragile the translation pathway is, particularly when evidence is seen to be generated really remotely to the setting, like in an ivory tower kind of context. If the practice is complex, and the recommendation is politically divisive. So we need to acknowledge that the translation of evidence into clinical decision-making is not a straight path. This example really one of the examples I've heard actually from some wonderful researchers from the UK, John Gabay and Andre Lemay from the University of Southampton, was that knowledge translation is a pinball machine where the pinball is the evidence and the many local cultural, social and practice needs of the clinicians are the levers, the springs, the traps. So I encourage everyone to see the journey of evidence into practice through this lens and understand that the evidence isn't even a shiny metal ball, it's a ball of putty. So as it moves through the local practice context, it morphs, it changes in response to local factors pushing against it. So by the time it's used, it's irrevocably changed. That's if it doesn't fall down a hole and is lost forever. So we need to use evidence more in the clinician's practice, but a weakness in our own evidence. Clinicians need to make these street-level decisions about which rules apply in which circumstances. Their approach has to be individualised. They have to judge the patient values as well as the numbers. And this approach is better aligned to the professional relationship-based care and is in fact what EBM looks like. The challenge that researchers have is to take proper account for these diverse knowledge, for the diverse knowledge clinicians have to draw on when the studies are designed. In the first place, to make sure the evidence we produced is valuable and applicable to them. So with this in mind, one possible solution is progressing what is known as bottom-up research. So the traditional model of research or knowledge production has been top-down. This is a type of knowledge production or research where dedicated experts in universities and other evidence-generating organisations, it's the idea of producing linear and this top-down didactic approach to knowledge translations, where evidence is gathered and synthesised, turned into recommendations or even mandates for practice. And those service providers, the clinicians, are expected to just take this on, account for it in their day-to-day work. In an ideal world, this approach should secure rapid and equal uptake of high-grade, carefully appraised evidence, for practice and speedy introduction of evidence-based innovations. But even in such an ideal world, it also presents a risk that clinicians will implement treatment principles rather than engage in ongoing quests to be evidence-based practitioners. The bigger risk is they end up stifled, obedient, compliant with an officially mandated evidence and not actually with their practitioner knowledge, their professional experience and their high-level experience, which manifests as intuition in a more creative manner. Compared to that top-down approach, the bottom-up approach emphasises locally driven evidence generation. So this is a more modern approach. There are no hard boundaries between knowledge production and knowledge utilisation, and innovation is considered to result from this continued interaction between clinicians and researchers. So through bottom-up research, there's an opportunity to find locally sensitive approaches to solve local problems or gaps in effectiveness. The main risk with this approach, of course, is that we unintentionally reinforce top-down, institutional preoccupations and priorities. So researchers coming in and making the call as to what it is that needs to be investigated and working with clinicians to do it. Instead, we need to really genuinely involve frontline practitioners in generating data, creating evidence for improvement and practice. So essentially, bottom-up research could mean the ball of evidence putty that is produced is already shaped to the local context, is less likely to change to suit clinicians' needs on the front line of healthcare. And so it's more reliable. With all of that in mind, as evidence-based meets the patient-centred and real-world principles of contemporary practice and policy, there's a body of evidence that's generating called knowledge mobilisation. And it is actually, I believe, another way of looking at bottom-up research within implementation science. So knowledge mobilisation acknowledges the value and importance of patient and clinician perspectives and insights in driving research and policy with real-world relevance. It acknowledges that not all knowledge comes from research. It's knowledge offered by all three domains of the evidence-based medicine paradigm as equal. And there's not a lot, there is a lot to gain by sharing knowledge between all parties. That's not to say that non-research knowledge can't be captured and tested in a robust, rigorous, and systematic way. In fact, what it means is the opposite. It means that research methods need to build in rigorous and systematic processes that support sharing and integrating knowledge from all sources. So there's participatory action research initiatives like UK have done heaps of work in this space, as I'm sure other areas of Europe have, and in which emphasize the importance of public and patient involvement in health research. These sort of models are just as applicable to clinician involvement, particularly when researching treatments and practices are structurally separated from conventional institutions such as university and hospitals, as is the case for a lot of osteopathy. The relationship between researchers and clinicians is not the same as it is for many other, not for many other, but for some of the other health professions. So that's kind of a basis that's now leading us into something Jerry is going to talk about, which is how we can better support osteopaths to take part and draw on that clinical experience and help to mobilize that knowledge to better expand and extend the research evidence that we have for osteopathy. So I'm going to stop sharing now and hand it over to Jerry seamlessly.
Thank you, Amy. So some of the work that I'm going to present is from work that has been conducted at NCORE, the National Council for Osteopathic Research, over the last few years. So I've been the director only for a year and a half. So some of the work is from my predecessors, including Professor Dawn Carnes. So there are different ways we can look at how we can support osteopaths to take part in research. And I think that, following on what Amy was describing, we can look at having actions or interactions with osteopaths which are maybe practice relevant to them or practice informed or practice based. And I will mostly touch on the first two that I've named, which will be examples of what we do at NCORE, what we've done in the past at NCORE, which have been so far fairly successful to engage with osteopaths. So if we start with practice relevant. So it seems obvious to say that, but obviously for us to know what is practice relevant to osteopaths, we would need to ask them, what do you need to know? What is important to you in your practice? Going back to what Amy just said about the importance of having, some sort of bottom-up approach, that will be part of the sort of engagement with osteopaths to make sure that it's not researchers doing, research in their ivory tower, but that the research is going to be meaningful to the users. And clinicians may consider research to be relevant if the treatment intervention aligns with the clinician's philosophy of care. And we see that quite often in osteopathy, where there might be trials that are published, and for multiple reasons, including sometimes because maybe the osteopaths who are reading the trials may not really have the skills to understand exactly what was tried or what was assessed in that trial. They don't recognize what they do in clinical practice in what they read in a trial. Another problem might be that the population may not fully reflect what the osteopaths see in their, with their patients. And that can happen, for example, where studies are conducted in clinic in the osteopathic educational institutions, where it's likely that the patients are going to be a bit different, maybe from different socioeconomic status and things like that. So again, there needs to be some sort of transfer that can be done from the data regarding the population that are going to be investigated. And then the fact that the treatment intervention reflects common practice. So I think there is a need that is quite clear for osteopaths to access practice relevant evidence. I suspect most of you are aware of this study that was published a few years ago now from colleagues at the ESO in Maidstone in the UK, where they interviewed clinic tutors who were reluctant to the use of clinical guidelines in the management of patients with low back pain. So again, it was, really assessing patients who were not really in favor of EBM. And what was interesting in that qualitative study is that they found that the usual pyramid of evidence that Amy showed earlier in her slide was completely upside down for them. And they were putting much more emphasis on expert opinion, and all the other, which usually would be considered as high level of evidence, were considered much less useful and relevant to their practice. So there might be a need for us to develop strategies to support the profession to grasp what evidence-based practice is and what it isn't, the fact that it's not about prescribing what people should be doing with their patients. And towards that, we have done some work, including with Paul, who is here, and David Hohenschmidt, who works at Imperial College London and at the UCO, and Chantal Morin, who is an osteopath and an OT in Canada, and Ollie Thompson, an osteopath in the UK. And Chantal, Ollie, and myself are part of a cohort, and we are, I was going to say facilitated, that's not the word I'm looking for, but Amy is one of the two leaders of that group, where it's about leadership in research in Australia. And part of that work was to try to look at how we can support osteopaths into reading and making sense of the literature. And we did this publication in French, and we did another one, which I'm not sure why now it's not working in the order I set up the PowerPoint, but anyhow. And we did another one, the same one, but in English, which is in open access in iJOM. And the idea was to give really easy tools for osteopaths to be able to read an RCT, to read a systematic review, case studies, or a qualitative study, and to try to look at, what are we trying to do with that sort of design? What are the common pitfalls to look for when you are reading one of these articles, and how can we interpret these findings? So that's some work that I think can support osteopaths to find evidence and to see how practically relevant it might be for them. These papers are being now moved on to webinars that we are developing. So Paul's webinar on RCTs and my webinar on reviews are now accessible for free. And I'm aware again that my PowerPoint slideshow it's completely messed up, but technically you were supposed to see the URL of where you can access these, but you can access this for free on the UCO CPT website. And yeah, it's just great. Round and run and run, fantastic. And then there's also a need to have a place where osteopaths can debate, discuss evidence, because we know that social media is probably not the best place for that. Social media is great on many levels. You can share information, it's easily accessible. There are different platforms for different age groups and so forth. But one thing that is not really good is supporting a positive debate with the profession. And in the UK, we've had numerous examples where it massively failed in the last year. So we need to find ways of supporting osteopaths to be able to talk and not feel judged, and to be able to also learn from these experiences. So at NCORE, we run research hubs, and we've been running them for many years. I used to attend them as a delegate 8-9 years ago in Oxfordshire. And now we run them. We run 4 or 5 of them every term. So that's an example of what we do. So we would set up a meeting. Since COVID, they've all been online. And that was quite a success, in fact, to move them online. And at the end of the meeting, they would choose the topic for the following meeting. So it would be the osteopaths themselves deciding what is important to them. So here they decided to look at how expectation affects treatment outcome and how to influence expectations. And we would send them a list of papers that were related to the topic. They would be sent that after the end of the previous meeting. So they would have a couple of months to read the papers. They don't have to read the 10 papers. They can read just a couple of papers, whatever they want to, it's all fine. But then they come with a little bit of being informed about what it is in the literature. And then the debate is around the quality of these papers, the meaning of these papers, how you can apply that in practice, what does it mean with patients, and so forth. And that is something that is quite easy to set up for an organization. The cost is fairly minimal, as you can expect, because it's just one person working for a couple of hours. For the meeting, there's a bit of preparation, but fairly minimal. And that is a good way to engage with osteopaths and evidence. Another thing, another thing that we've started doing a bit more than a year ago is to run evidence summaries. So my colleague, Dr. Carol Fox, and myself usually run these. So that's an example of the one we did 6 or so months ago, where we try to bring either 2 papers or a new guideline and a new paper. And there was a new guideline that was just published on Koda-Equina syndrome. So Carol presented that one. For half an hour, we present the content, but also we talk about the methods, and we look at possible limitations or strengths of that paper. And I was talking about low back pain and osteopathic treatment, and I brought 2 different trials that had quite different findings, and discussing why these findings were different and what was the meaning of that. And to these evidence summaries, we invite all the OEI, so osteopathic education institutions in the UK, and that's for their faculty, for their students, but also all our stakeholders, which are the General Osteopathic Council, the Institute of Osteopathy, the Osteopathic Foundation, and some of the postgraduate courses, so that their faculty can also attend. And the idea is really to keep them up to date with what is published, but also to use that as a way to integrate some knowledge and skills around evidence and how to appraise the quality. And that is fairly successful. The feedback we are receiving is quite positive. So now if we look at some examples which are a bit more practice informed, and one way we can define that is by having evidence that is used to inform the service delivery, and that should derive from a wider range of sources. And I think that is really something quite important. Amy already explained that, but this idea, like you can imagine a researcher with their white coat and working with rats, and that's that sort of knowledge that is going to inform all the rest, the sort of top-down approach is really passé and old-fashioned, and we are moving quite a lot away from that. For example, in the UK, but in many countries, now it's barely impossible to have any funding without involving members of the public or patients at the beginning of the whole thing. So looking at the design, but even the statistical analysis plan, all of that has to be involving members of the public. And the reason is because an RCT might be £1 million, £2 million. You don't want to be spending £2 million to have an answer that is not useful at all to patients. So it's really important to have what is called, expert patients or members of the public taking part into these designs. So again, a couple of examples that we've been running at NCORE to try to develop practice-informed projects. That wasn't, in fact, NCORE, that was with my UCO role. So we've just completed a 3-year project where we looked at the experience of students who belong to underrepresented groups and their experience during their training. And to do this, we did a mixed method study but I'm not going to go too much into details because that's not really the point. But as you can see, the bubble at the bottom left-hand side was community involvement. And we had a fair idea what it might look like, the project. And then we had our meeting with lots of students from different OEIs, and we understood that we were going completely in the wrong direction. And from discussing with them, we learned that the words we were planning to use were completely wrong, but also if we wanted to have something that was meaningful for them to make sure that it was useful for their experience as a student, we had to change it. And this sort of community involvement carried on until the end. The end was a conference that we ran last month, and a third of the attendees were students. And it was really a big, really important part of the project because it was not on students, but it was really a project with students. Another way to have practice-informed evidence is to do consensus projects, or a common one is the Delphi process, and I'm sure you're aware of these two examples, which are quite old now, but nearly 10 years ago there was a Delphi process that had been conducted to look at what osteopaths felt were the research priorities. And that now is a little bit outdated. And in fact, there's work at the moment being done to update this work. And another one, even older, 14 years ago, looked at adverse events in manual therapies. And again, that was a Delphi consensus study. And this sort of thing is a good way, and it's a method that is quite common to gather thoughts from experts. And these experts can be clinicians, or it could be patients, or it could be other healthcare professionals. Whatever group is the one having the knowledge, and going to them to gather that sort of embodied knowledge that these groups have. Another way to do a practice-informed evidence is to run patient-reported outcome measures. So as you might be aware, at ENCORE, we've been running PROMs for 8 years or so, I think. And we are collecting data from patients. The main aim of PROMs, one of the important aspects of PROMs is that the data is not collected through the clinician, but indirectly. So it's here ENCORE with the patient, sending information to the patient, and then the interaction is without involving the practitioner, to try to minimize the risk of bias in the way of collecting data. For those of you who are in Europe, the EFFO are running, they have funded a pilot study to support PROMs across Europe. So you might be one of the organizations running that, and it's with ENCORE that this project is being conducted. So we are now collecting data in a lot of European countries, but also countries around the world. And one way of PROMs being used is to support professions getting recognition and validation, which is really good. But really the main aim is to provide data back to the osteopaths, so then they can inform their practice from their own evidence and their own data. Another project that we've been running, which has been a very big headache, if I'm completely honest, so I'm not sure I would highly suggest you doing one, but is to do single case experimental designs. The reason why I loved the idea of doing one is that it's a fantastic work with clinicians, and it's really clinicians and researchers working together. And it worked really well, but the infrastructure, the IT infrastructure required for running one is really, really bonkers, basically. It's so hard because you collect data from patients on a daily basis for 3 months. And the questionnaires are not always the same and all that. So it requires really, so it's very complex. It looks simple on the paper, but in fact, it's quite complex. The analysis is a little bit complex, but that usually with a good statistician is fine. But it's much more the infrastructure that is quite difficult. But putting that aside, this is So I did this project a couple of years ago. I think we completed it a couple of months ago. But the interaction with clinicians between academics and clinicians was fantastic. And having data from patients that we were sending back to the osteopaths for them to inform the discussion with their patient, that was such a, we often think about research taking 10 years to be put in practice. With a SCED, the evidence is generated from practice and put back into practice straight away. So the sort of timeline is much, much shorter. So there are really good aspects of it, but be aware that it's a minefield to set up. And finally, Amy is going to talk about practice-based research network. And this is something at NCORE that we are currently setting up, and Dr. Daniel Bailey is with us listening to the call, and he's going to be the one leading the project at NCORE. And we're running a series of focus groups on practice-based research network at the moment with osteopaths. So at our next workshop in September, I will have data to share with you on this. So Amy, if you want to share your screen, I will stop sharing mine.
All right, thank you, Jerry. That was really great. So as mentioned, it's now time to talk about the potential for practice-based research networks to help support this body of work. And a lot of the examples that Jerry gave really kind of nest quite nicely within the context of something like a PBRN, with being clear for consistency on what is a practice-based research network. Many of you will have heard of it, but just so that we're all on the same page. This is a definition that was provided from the US group. The model is actually incredibly popular in the US. They got some targeted funding from the US government. At Arkham, in my research group, the daily US model to suit the kind of complementary integrative medicine landscape. The main difference is really around the acknowledgement, as Jerry said, that the IT infrastructure of a lot of the US-based PBRNs relies on them being really closely embedded into the existing health system and hospital system, and a lot of access to shared files and casework, mega centres of health care delivery that support PBR data collection. And so they have quite a different model to the one that we have, but we'll be talking about that a little bit more at the next workshop. What I will focus on today instead is the role of PBRNs can have in facilitating better clinician researcher partnerships. So the whole definition of a PBRN is really about ambulatory practices, clinical practices with walk-in patients. They're primarily focused to primary care of patients, and they have affiliated missions. So they've shared interests. In this case, it would just be osteopathy. It would be the affiliated mission to investigate questions related to their community-based practice and improving the quality of care. So ultimately what the nature of PBR support the formal collaborations between these community-based practices and academic institutions where the researchers are most commonly housed. In the work that's produced through PBRNs, they help to support research findings that are relevant to clinicians and more easily assimilated into everyday practice. They promote that bottom-up versus, as well as top. They can enable either, but also it allows for examining broad range of research questions, particularly with the methodology or the structure that we use with Arkham. One of the reasons for it is, earlier, there's lots of different questions that need to be answered, particularly in professions with emerging research evidence bases such as osteopathy, and you need the flexibility to undertake lots of different methodologies to answer those really diverse questions. So I'd like to introduce you to some of the PBRNs coordinated by Arkham. And there's three that are the main active at the moment. The PRACI it's got 14 complementary medicine professions. It's the most diverse multi-profession practice-based research network for complementary medicine in the world. Orion had the largest coverage of any health profession in the world, led by Osteopathy Australia. It's the Australian Osteopathy PBRN. It had 43% of the Australian osteopathic profession enlisted until Osteopaths New Zealand supported ORC-NZ to be formed, and that now has had 48% of the osteopaths in New Zealand as members. So combined, they're 45% of the Australasian professions. So I'm just also going to show that ACORD is another one that was our first PBRN while it was operating and produced significant outputs for the chiropractic profession in Australia. And more recently, NCOR starting up their osteopathy PBRN for the UK, Power, but Jerry could tell you more about that one. We come back to that in the next workshop. So despite the unique achievements of the PBRNs that we've run through ARCM, they do share the universal characteristics. So they all capture data through a naturalistic setting about naturalistic practice. They involve real-world clinicians, real-world patients, real-world treatments, and the way that, particularly for clinicians that exist outside of the system, it's not like we've got university hospitals commonly accessible for osteopathy, where data is just automatically collected because it's in a university hospital. These PBRN infrastructures helps to set up the capacity for the amazing work that happens in clinical practice to be collected and reported to the world. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of how PBRN research can build on clinician knowledge. So these are from some of the other PBRNs that we have as well. And you know, and you can also, I'm sure you can imagine some of these examples. They dovetail really nicely with some of the examples that Jerry has given around practice-informed, practice-relevant research as well. So Bradley Leach was a PhD student with ARCM. For his honours project, he surveyed clinicians' experience in treating intestinal permeability, and he did that through Pracky. He collected his data through Pracky and identified the alignment between the clinician's observation and the existing evidence regarding intestinal permeability, but he also noticed some gaps in applying evidence in their practice. So in his PhD, he undertook a co-design project using the knowledge to action cycle model for implementation science to co-create clinical practice guidelines for the effective diagnosis of intestinal permeability. So he partnered with clinicians, patients, and industry to do this and produced a tool that applied practice-informed evidence to support evidence-informed practice. So that cycle took place. He identified the gap through practice and then worked with the clinicians who he initially surveyed to help to develop the clinical practice guidelines as well. Another ARCM PhD student, Rebecca Redmond, undertook a content analysis project that integrated expert opinions documented in traditional and contemporary naturopathic texts for the treatment of menstrual disorders. She also used Pracky to do this. To follow up for this, she surveyed naturopathic clinical practice and used that as a method of drawing on their experiential clinical knowledge and reductive complaints. She captured their insights into how the traditional and contemporary treatments that were documented in the text are used in routine daily care and the value that the clinicians placed on them. Did they find them useful, particularly for the treatment of endometriosis? She then triangulated and synthesized these various knowledge types to inform an intervention for a planned clinical trial, which will also be able to be conducted through Pracky. And just as the last example I'm going to share with you, Hope Foley's research on patient-centered care. Hope Foley, her PhD built on previous work she conducted in a student clinic by surveying patients of 5 professions: massage therapy, acupuncture, osteopathy, chiropractic, and naturopathy. And she surveyed these patients about their experiences of the care they received with a specific focus on the domains of person-centered care. So there's a huge shift in Australia at the moment, possibly a bit slower than other parts of the world, with regards to how do we most effectively build person-centered care into chronic illness care. So these particular professions were chosen because her PhD explored that person-centered care in patients with chronic disease And these 5 professions were among the most common complementary integrative medicine services accessed by patients with chronic illness in Australia. But her project was originally planned to focus just on massage therapists, acupuncturists, and naturopaths. But because ACORN was in place and she was able to easily extend her project to also include osteopaths and chiropractors. So her project was the first to be conducted across all 3 Australian-based PBRNs that we ran. And she was able to develop evidence that demonstrated that the different professions in their own way delivered patient-centered care. So this is evidence that osteopathy would not have had if it hadn't had a PBRN, because she would not have included osteopathy in the sample. I guess so with these examples, I mean, Jerry's given of some similar types of studies that have been conducted without PBRN. So why even bother with a PBRN to undertake these projects? And I guess it's really about facilitating an easy clinician researcher partnership. And it does that through a few really wonderful ways. So firstly, it collects localized data, which increases the translation and uptake of the results. So clinicians are contributing to practice, and they know the findings relate to practices just like theirs. So Bradley Leach's study, for example, will be that much more powerful because he worked with the clinicians who his original survey was based on to improve what they do. They're less likely to dismiss his work as irrelevant if they contributed to the findings. And it's also an efficient use of research resources. You'll notice that each of the projects I gave other work of research students. This isn't a coincidence. There were other studies that have used, many other studies using this PBRNs that I could have shown you that are led by very experienced researchers, but these students aren't operating with large grants and substantial support. They are leveraging the infrastructure of the PBRNs to produce research with very little research funding. And the research still has real and meaningful impact, not only the field of integrative medicine, but to the clinicians they're working with to collect the data and produce the knowledge. And for anyone who's working in the area of research funding is very difficult to come by, and this can be a really appealing attribute to most researchers I know. And it also works for the clinicians. The infrastructure of the PBRNs means more evidence is being generated in these professions. As I said before, Hope Foley extended her project to include osteopaths and chiropractors simply because of the existence of these profession-specific PBRNs. There are multiple other examples of studies that have run or being run through our PBRN had the PBRNs not existed. And I know this because the researchers have told me. The value of the simple existence of this infrastructure should not be underestimated. And lastly, they create a community of practice. They create links between individuals across all areas of clinic and research that support practice-informed, and practice-based research. They offer a network of like-minded individuals who share a common aim and a sense of contributing to something larger than themselves. The sense of community is invaluable among professions that are commonly characterized by solo community-based practices that are often structurally, if not geographically, isolated from other health professionals and services. So there are, of course, other means of undertaking real-world research, and I encourage you to explore the options. We all, as a community of clinicians and researchers, need to lean into this evolving landscape of health research. So as a challenge that I set to you, next time you plan a research project, think about whether you are drawing on all of the expertise you need to make it relevant and ensure the knowledge produced will mean something in the real world. If you are representing an organisation, consider establishing a PBRN in your own country to support. If you're a clinician, get involved in a PBRN so your voice and perspective can be added to research on and in your practices. And if you're a researcher, consider whether a PBRN can be a useful resource for your next project, whether as a sub-study run through an existing PBRN or by working with others to establish a PBRN of your own. But we'll explore all these things in more detail in the next couple of workshops. So thank you all very much for your time.
So thank you so much to both of you. I think it's really nice how we had this oversight on what are the challenges with research and how can we better relate to the real world, and also kind of narrow this gap that there might be between researchers and practitioners. And it ended up showing what PBRNs are and how they fit into this niche. We also see it as a big opportunity to be able to create a dialogue between practitioners and researchers and start doing top-down and bottom-up research. So now that we have these views, I hope that you have a better vision of why PBRNs might be interesting for your own research activity, but also for your community, and also how to outreach to better implementation of your research results. And also to think, as Amy invited you, how could this be useful in a project? Because as we will see in the next workshop, the best way to actually create a PBRN is to have a project which is built initially around a PBRN, so you can do them both together. And that way you also have the input from that community into your research. I don't think it's been mentioned, but anyone that's has used a PBRN also sees a very big advantage into knowing or not whether their intervention is implementable, because given it's provided or it's delivered in real world situations, you come up with problems and you improve your intervention. The other thing is that all the people that contribute to the research, when the research is finished, if it does work, you don't need to train them to be able to work and deliver that intervention. They've already done it. So it's a really good way also to link these elements and bring research straight into practice. So I'm inviting you to note down the date for the workshop number 2. We'll be sending you some reminders and a link. Probably the link will be the same one as this one. I'll try and set up that you don't have the password. I'm really sorry for the people who weren't able to enter because they couldn't find it and ended up finding it. But so I'm really inviting you to the second workshop, where we'll be going more into what challenges are there and what do we have to think of when we're doing a PBRN. And that way you'll have a better vision of knowing whether or not in your own ideas or in the research you're leading, whether or not this solution could be something where it's worth for you or your institution to put some time into creating PBRN. I don't know if Jerry or Amy, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm looking forward to getting into this next time in September and the nuts and bolts of what can work and seeing this, yeah.
And I think also for the people who are there, if suddenly you start thinking about that and you have questions, don't hesitate to write them down so that for the next meeting, you can really post them along the way, because it'll be more the technical aspects of how it works and so on. But thank you all for attending. Thank you so much, Amy, for getting up so early this morning for us.
Right, the sun's up now, so that's good.
Yeah,
it's
nice. Exactly what I was thinking. It was lovely to see the sun, coming up on your side when here it's getting darker, and it was quite nice to see.
And thanks a lot, Jerry, for your time, your insight, and sharing all the experiences from these studies, both by yourself and by NCORE. And I'm really looking forward to see you all in September, and hope we'll ruminate all that and start seeing the letters PBRNs pop up everywhere as we go along.